So firstly, Samyukta, thank you so much for agreeing to have this discussion with us. As you know, this is part of our second issue of Vidhi's newsletter called Towards Inclusive Education. And this issue, what we want to talk about is national education policy and the implications of the different aspects of that for inclusive education at large. And of course, one of the key aspects of that is early childhood education provisioning, because it essentially has the ability to sort of reduce a lot of the inequalities we might see crop up, later on in a child's schooling journey. So we thought we could start off with maybe a quick summary of what NEP actually says about early childhood education.
Thanks, Nisha. So there's been a lot of talk around early childhood education in the early years with the National Education Policy 2020. It's not like other policies have not mentioned it, but this policy actually talks about a continuum going from the early years up to grade 1 and 2 and thinking of that as the early years. So some of the things that this policy highlights, I'd like to share with you through some slides, just so that we're on the same page when we, talk about some of the issues around it. So if we were to look at the policy, if we look at the policy, I'm going to talk about four things in the policy which sort of stand out. The first one is this visual that hits you, I think, on page 2 of the policy, saying let's look at a different curricular structure. So what's different about this structure? In the past, we've always had schools, especially government schools or public schools, beginning from grade 1 and going up to grade 12. And so you had what we used to call a 10 plus 2 structure. So you have 1 to 10, and then you have the 2 years above. And what this structure is doing is it's saying, let's combine grades 9, 10, 11, 12 at the top. And it's saying, let us give recognition and importance to the early years before grade 1. So it's actually adding 3 years before grade 1, making this entire curricular structure of about 15 years, which was 12 years earlier. So in the private space, if you look at it, you have private schools and you have upper KG, lower KG, nursery, and so on. In most of our government schools, we begin from grade 1. And then, of course, we all know that there are private schools with preschools in them, and then you change schools to go to grade 1. So basically, this policy is saying, look at 5 years together. Age 3, 4, 5, and then age 6 and 7 when you get into grades 1 and 2. That's 5 years plus 3 years of grades 3 to 5, 3 years of grades 6 to 8, and then grades 9 to 12. So I think that's a big one. Then the second is around access and provisioning, where it talks about where do we go to get early childhood education. So it could be private preschools, so that's standalone preschools for you. It could be standalone Anganwadis. Anganwadis are community-based preschool centers set up by the government. The Anganwadis are run by the Women and Child Welfare Department. Then you have Anganwadis within primary schools or government schools. And then you have pre-primary sections within government schools. And then this policy talks about Bal Vatika, which is basically 1 year before going into grade 1, which is preparation for entry into grade 1. It also talks about capacity building of Anganwadi workers and teachers and how they should be trained, what that training should look like, who should be responsible for the content and the curriculum. It talks about the NCERT, which is with the education department, laying out that curriculum. And then it talks about governance and administration, which is basically how, different departments working together, forming a joint task force to ensure quality education in the early years. So 4 things I wanted to bring out for you: the new curricular pedagogical structure, the access and provisioning, capacity building, and governance and administration.
Right. Yeah, this is extremely helpful. And I think it sort of pushes us right into the conversation we wanted to have. As you said very rightly, since the draft policy itself has come out, there's been a lot of buzz about this particular aspect, right? The focus on early childhood, this continuum.
Yeah.
There are many different providers, etc. And I think one of the sort of unique perspectives that not too many people can give us is your experience and expertise interacting with these different stakeholders, right? So, I mean, just very quickly or broadly, how are these different departments or different state governments, the MWCD, the MHRD, how are these different departments responding to this policy and this call for like coordination suddenly and consensus on curriculum, etc.?
Yeah. Nisha, it's early days yet. The policy has just been launched. So I think different governments and departments are thinking about what's possible, what should happen. There are different layers within every department as well. Who will create the content? How will it be implemented? What is the training going to look like? And so I think, and the MHRD, which again, now they are renaming as the Ministry for School Education, it has started the conversations around the new education policy, what it means. It's been in the news for different reasons. And so, every government, some of the governments that I'm connected with, because I work with Pratham and the earlier team, many of the governments where we are working are forming committees to understand what the national education policy is about and what it is saying. Having said that, I think there's the education department which comes into this in a big way, because there's a big focus on them and what they should be doing. How do they set up the early years before grade 1 in their schools? What is that content going to look like? Women and Child Department, which has been doing this traditionally, working with Anganwadis, thinking about what's their role now. I think some, confusion, conflict there. And then private schools also wondering about what they're supposed to be doing. If I'm standalone, what should I do? Like, should I begin grade 1 and 2, or should I just close shop? I think these are some of the, things that people are thinking about, but not really, we haven't really, we've just started.
But so, I mean, one of the questions that a few academics have sort of come up with is, in the long term, right? We know that like ICDS and Anganwadi, the system is quite overburdened. They have many different responsibilities, and early childhood provisioning is only one of them. Education, sorry, is only one of them. So given that, some people have suggested maybe in the long term, this policy is sort of suggesting that we move early childhood education out of ICDS completely, right? So again, just broad question, but like, do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, Nisha, thank you for asking me that question. For many years now, we've been working with Anganwadis. Pre-primary within government schools is a nascent concept, though there are states like Punjab and Himachal which have launched it in a big way over the last 2-3 years. I think the rest of the country will catch up with this policy coming into focus. But my work with Anganwadis has taught me two things. One, I think the way in which it's laid out, like I understand there are competing priorities within Anganwadis. There's health, there's nutrition, there's education. But I have a feeling that, this was well thought out at the time that it was. The ICDS project, there are about 1.3 million Anganwadis across the country. And it talks about immunization, health and nutrition, education, referral services. And at one level, it seems like, oh my God, there's so much to be done. But at another level, I think there's a reason that health, nutrition, and education go hand in hand. This policy talks about, the fact that I think they say more than 85% of brain development happens before the age of 6.
Yeah.
We know that from evidence. And I think both health, nutrition, and education, all three play a huge role here. So there's a reason that it was in those Anganwadis in the first place. And yes, we must accept that there's a lot more to be done when it comes to education and early childhood education within Anganwadis. But my point is that we don't have to try and repair something that's not broken. And in this case, what's not broken, I think, is the fact that this goes hand in hand, the education and health bit, and the fact that the Anganwadi worker is connected to the community especially mothers and children and adolescent girls, in a way that I don't think any other department is.
Right.
So just to give you a sense, one Anganwadi is typically, it caters to about 250 homes in
Hmm.
any, and that's how we are 1.3 million. So so this Anganwadi worker knows who's pregnant, who needs the, who are the lactating mothers, who need the vitamins. She knows everything about that community, and she has a connect with the mother that no one else does.
Right.
And just because of the sheer numbers, I don't think schools can replace the Anganwadis, because they outnumber, the Anganwadis outnumber the number of schools.
Right.
So very, to your question, should we be pulling out education? My answer is no. But what can we do to support it so that the quality of education is much better? I
Right.
think that's something we should think about.
So I was actually going to come to this at a later point, but maybe since you've spoken about, the Anganwadi Center and its closeness to the community and the household unit, maybe I can bring it up now. But there is some mention in the policy document about this age group of 0 to 3 as well. And there is some sort of, there is an implication that parental engagement and community engagement needs to be, in a sense, looked at as well. But it's not very clear, right? We know from different projects, we know from evidence out there that parental engagement plays a huge component for especially early childhood education and for the question of inequality as well, right? Huge determinant there. So, any sort of ideas on how parental engagement can be made a bigger part or a bigger focus of early childhood education provisioning in our country?
Yeah. So, to the first part of your question, Nisha, 0 to 3 years, yes, it's been talked about. They've talked about creation of a curriculum, a framework, that again NCRT would be responsible for, and so on. But this 0 to 6 years is opened out in a big way when it comes to Anganwadis and the Women and Child Welfare Department, because the vitamin supplements, the education, the immunization, all of that is very important for this entire age group.
Right.
And there, the mother and the child, I think, the way in which schemes have been incentivized for mothers, the kind of functions that are organized around, for example, this month there is a Poshan Abhiyan around nutrition, trying to overcome malnutrition. There's breastfeeding week, there's deworming week, there's all of that that's happening. Almost all, I think it's almost, I would say 99.9% cases or 100%, all this engagement is actually with mothers. And so that's why I think there's a lot to learn from the Anganwadi system on how to engage with mothers. Today, I think our awareness around, working with communities and mothers is much higher, because we are in a post-COVID situation where we don't have schools that are open. So interestingly, whether it's education or education departments or Anganwadis, everyone's, looking at the caregiver, and the caregiver is the grandparent or the parent.
Right.
And I'm hoping that, when things get back to normal, there is indeed a new normal where this engagement with parents continues. Where it's not seen as a substitute for something that can happen in class, because I think both are equally important, what we teach in class and what's happening in the home. We've learned a lot in the last few months, and if we take these learnings forward, I think that would be a new way of engaging with parents, especially when it comes to teaching and learning. Yes, and with the early years, again, I'll say that we have some sense of what we do with mothers when it comes to Anganwadis.
Yeah.
I can't say the same about schools.
Yeah.
And with Pratham, where I work, we work a lot with mothers groups. So we create groups of mothers and then look at what kind of teaching learning can happen there, so that the mothers want to do something with their children. They don't know how. And so we focus a lot more on that. So if we create what can happen with parents while something is already happening within schools or Anganwadis, I think that would be a great way to move forward.
But another part of this policy that has received a lot of attention is this focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. And there has been, a lot of people very vocal about how, yes, this is absolutely important. We know that our children are falling behind. There's a huge learning deficit in our country, especially for elementary education, which then has repercussions over the lifetime of a child in school. But then there are also, say, educationists specifically, right, who are saying that the way in which this policy is framed, and if interpreted, improperly, might lead to sort of a schoolification of education, even for early childhood, which could be problematic. And just to point out, the policy does specifically use words like play-based learning, right? But at the same time, it talks about monitoring, it talks about tracking learning, it talks about school readiness. So with respect to this, do you feel like there are certain challenges, certain things we should be afraid of or try to sort of overcome even before the roadmaps are set out?
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely, Nisha. I think that's a very important question around assessment. So my take on assessment, I think one has to first understand what does assessment mean, like having some clarity around what that means, and for whom is that assessment. Who is it for? So, for instance, if I were to look in my own life, we go for health checkups every year. That's basically an assessment of how fit I am, and then that data actually tells me, I need to lose weight, and so then I think of a regimen, where I should lose weight, and sometimes I don't do anything about it. I just sit with that data and grow. I just put on more weight, right? So I think assessment, for whom then becomes very important, so that they can then take action around it. I think it needs to be empowering. So this policy, I have to say, it's landmark in that it says at one place that the entire policy becomes irrelevant if we don't look at foundational literacy and numeracy. Yeah. And it's for the first time that a policy has actually said this. And I think there's no going away from the evidence around this. For example, ASER, the annual status of education report, is a rural household survey that talks about the fact that around 50% of children in grade 5 cannot read a simple grade 2 level textbook. So I think there's no going away from that. But the purpose of that survey or any assessment should be to actually empower the person who's doing that assessment. In an early years classroom, I would think that teacher should understand where her children are, so that she can then make the corrections that she needs to in her curriculum, in her teaching, in the process that she is using in order to be able to pay attention to certain kids and so on. But unfortunately, this data at scale in India has a way of just going up. It doesn't come down. It's got to come down to the classroom. Instead, it goes up to the government levels where those people are not in the classroom. So if that data doesn't come back to the class, to the teacher's hands, and it's not, and I'm not very fond of this word monitoring. I feel like support that teacher to understand that data so that she can do something about it. Right? She wants that child to do better, but right. How does she get to that child to do better is what assessment can do for her. Of course, the assessment for older children has to be has to be different from that of younger children. So this fear around downward extension, I think it's also a fear because in the policy talks about the NCERT coming up with the curriculum, the content, and government schools, again, maximum government schools beginning with grade 1. I think there's a fear around, when we know something, we tend to apply that to get to something we don't know. So in this case, if I know a lot about school grades, I'll simply extend it downwards to an age group that I don't know much about. But there, I think there's a role that civil society, people who run pre-primary, experts in this field, they will have a lot to, they should have a lot to say around this. The early years ASER that was done earlier this year used a different methodology to understand what children can do, the games they can play, sequencing activities, patterns. So one has to sort of calibrate the assessment given the age of the child. I think what one has to be careful about is that what we do is developmentally appropriate for children in this age group. And if we are mindful of that, I hope this fear doesn't actually play out. So.
Right. Right, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's a very important point of just assessments and everything else we do needs to be developmentally appropriate. So another point, of course, is on, and it's related to this again, the schoolification, the fear that because NCRT is now to come up with this, single curriculum across age groups, we don't really know whether it's going to subsume the ICDS. It already has a curriculum of its own. We know that as well. But I guess the question is sort of coming from, do we feel like there's enough focus in this policy given to inclusive education of different marginalized groups in constructing this now new curriculum, right? Because this is an opportunity to say, yes, we already have certain curriculums out there, but now keeping in mind early childhood education, are there these new components of inclusivity that we can, or like a new lens of inclusivity that we can add to the curriculum?
So Nisha, this policy, after you asking this question, I looked at the policy again, and it talks about inclusion in a different section, but it doesn't talk about inclusion and early childhood education together. Um, so even before I begin to talk about curriculum, just to say, Nisha, it worries me. On the one hand, I feel like I'm so happy you've talked about inclusion in this policy. It talks about the SEDG, which is socio-economically disadvantaged groups. But it worries me when we start looking at things in silos, and we don't mention it in the rest of the chapters. Much before this, just to share with you, the draft policy came out a year back. There was a lot of discussion, and I think I was one of the million people who wrote back to the government saying, I think this should happen. Okay. And one of the points I mentioned there was, if you really see, if you want to talk about inclusion, let's talk about it in every chapter of this book, of this policy. Let's not put it in one chapter, so that if you miss that chapter, you've forgotten that you had to do something about it, right? And that's my fear with the early years. There's so much focus on the early years, but the people who read the early years chapters may not read the inclusion chapters. And when you talk about females and transgenders and disability, females, I'm assuming the rest of the policy is also for females. Like I'm assuming it, but it worries me when you say it this way. So I have some strong views there. If we talk about curriculum, then I think we need to get there. This particular policy in the chapter on inclusion talks about access. It talks about how to get access, and it's very important what they're saying about access for the marginalized, and I'm glad they've touched upon it. I wish we could have gone further with that. It also talks about for older years, it talks about the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalayas being extended to grade 12, which I think would be a great step forward. And it also talks about a gender inclusion fund, which again, a great idea, but I think we still need guidelines around how is this going to be functional, who will it reach, where will the resources come from, what is this for, etc. So I'm awaiting the guidelines around the gender inclusion fund.
I completely agree with you there. And I think there has been a lot of talk about this as well, right? When you put inclusion in a silo, as opposed to use it as a lens to talk about an entire, across the entire policy. And that's really what we should be trying to do. Some of the research that you had done, I think this was independent research you had done, was on a gender transformative approach to early childhood education, right? And it was essentially about saying that, I guess in a sense, we're never too young to start thinking about inclusion and making that a part of the way in which we teach our children.
Yeah, I do think like if the gender inclusion fund and other things come in, something is definitely possible. It's not like it's been ruled out. It's just that it's not been articulated the way some of us would have liked it to be. In this, just in terms of my paper, what I wrote about, it was basically if we want to change whether it is access or learning for the marginalized, if we want to change that, then what it requires is a change in behavior, a change in mindset. And there is no the earlier one begins, the better it would be if that's what we want to see.
Mhm.
I think in the a lot the roots of the inequities that we see in the early years are actually manifested in later years. So when we talk about children who've dropped out in later years, we see the kind of violence in later years. When we and I'm talking about both girls and boys. When we look at early marriage, I think all of this, the roots of it actually begin in the early years. And that's why I'm making a case to say, can we do this can we begin early? And can we influence the adults in the ecosystem of the child in order to actually bring about this change?
Right.
Um, and even here, with the policy also, I feel, policy change is one thing, but bringing about a change in mindset, behavioral change, I think that's what actually will make the big difference. If we look at the data, in terms of where are girls and boys going in India, and this is important because if the learning trajectories, where children go, when do they enter school, all of this becomes important in the early years. So we find that 68% girls in rural India go to government schools or public schools, and 61% go to private. 61% boys go to government schools. So I'll say that again: 68% girls go to government schools, 61% boys go to government schools. What that means is that there are parents who are taking decisions for their children based on their, whether they are girls or boys.
Right.
So if I have less resources, I choose who I want to invest in. And, the data seems to indicate that, parents feel private school education is aspirational, it's going to get my child further, and it's my boy who should probably get there. There could be other reasons too for this profile that we see. But it's important to note that across years, across different age groups, we find more and more girls in government schools and more boys in private schools. Similarly, in grade 1, we find a different trajectory, and we can talk a little more about that later. But again, this is a warning bell. If you're a girl, you're most likely going to a government school. There are decisions being made for you right from the day you're born, and one of them is, where do you go?
Right.
Yeah, and there's a lot more. I mean, one can share about my paper, but maybe another time. Many of these things, I think, in this policy, through the renewed focus on early years, I'm hopeful that we can work on some of these aspects. Yes, and the the adults who are making these choices, thinking, you asked me earlier about parental engagement, and I think that becomes equally important here. If you're going to influence their choices, the decisions they make, uh, those are guided by their belief systems and aspirations. And so again, another reason for working with the community, for working with mothers and fathers.
And another point that you brought up, Samyukta, was, I think, very important. You said that the policy, specifically in its section on inclusion, talks about access, right? And that is something that in most policy documents, we see that, right? The focus is on getting access to the schooling system, whether it's mainstream versus a special school, whether it's for, girl children, tribal communities, etc. What I guess is, the next step then is, how do we think about inclusion once you're in school, right? What do we do with the experience of inclusion? So there is also evidence now, again, coming back to girl children, we know that there's, evidence of teachers focusing more on boys in certain subjects and girls on, different subjects. So more humanities for girls, science and math for boys. And, that leading to sort of phenomenon like math anxiety and things like that. Even if we talk about, for example, Section 12(1)(c), children from disadvantaged groups going into private schools, right? Even over there, we know that their experiences are starkly different than that of their peers and fee-paying students, even when they come from sometimes similar backgrounds as well. So I think there's so much that needs to be said and spoken about when it comes to experience, and then, of course, outcomes as well. And does this policy kind of address that in any way? And is there even a space for policy when you talk about experience of inclusion?
No, this policy, I think it does talk. I mean, it does talk about equal participation of children with disabilities. The sort of resources that should be there, training that should happen. I think, it's says all the right things, but because I'm in the field of implementation, I feel like it's the policy can give you a direction, but for instance, Section 12(1)(a)(c) that you talked about, it is it is the law. I mean, one has to do it. But what are those systems to cope with what one has to do? That I think has to be opened out. Um, so, for instance, when we want people to, if you want to have an egalitarian approach, if you want to not have inequity in the classroom, then what sort of training, what lens are the teachers in class wearing in order to do this? One has to refer again to today's times, where in this post-COVID situation, there's this talk around who has smartphones and who doesn't. Now, from my study, and I'm sure many other studies out there, we know that the ownership of the phone, especially a smartphone, is most likely going to be with the male, or the head of the house who's a male. So if I want to reach out to a girl in grade 7, how am I going to reach out to her if she, wherever she lives? So inequities in terms of even reaching out in this online world where, a lot of people don't have the phone, and then even if they do, the boys may have it, the girls may not. If the girls have the phone, there's still an apprehension that, if the girl gets the phone, what's she going to do with it? As compared to if the boy gets a phone, what's he going to do with it? And these are, I think, mindsets and belief systems which which have to change over time. But what that requires is for us, people like you, me, whether it's legal experts or journalists, to look at how are we depicted in media, what control over technology do we have, girls and boys, what are those beliefs that guide the aspirations for girls and boys, what do we say to our children, who can step out of the house and who can't, who has a curfew and who doesn't, what kind of clothes do each of us wear, what sort of language do we use? So I think like this is much beyond what a policy can say, but it's definitely in the realm of practice, and we need many leaders of practice, as it were.
To conclude again very broadly, what do you think some of the key challenges might be going forward? And I know we've touched upon some, coordination of departments, etc. But what are some of the main things that we should sort of be looking out for, maybe tracking, trying to, help build capacity, etc.?
I think we'll have to see how what is written in this policy actually plays out. One of the things, that this policy hasn't done is it hasn't analyzed, what did the previous policies say and why did they not work? For instance, this policy talks about spending, 6% of GDP on education. All the earlier policies talked about it. But why did it not happen? Are those going to be the same reasons that this policy also won't happen? I mean, I'm not being pessimistic, but I'm just saying, where's the evidence, around what worked and what didn't work? And then where's the how around how do we make it work? I feel like this policy needs to get there. I think it's a great document. It's begun on the right note, but we'll have to look out for how this pans out and what are those things that come in the way of it actually being implemented. I think that's one. The other is, because it's talking about the first 5 years, this is a new, for all of us, a multi-year approach, looking at where children are going and how, and looking at contexts, because this is a policy at the national level. Every state has a different trajectory for its kids. The Right to Education Act says that children at age 6 should be in grade 1. But we have data which says, 4 out of every 10 children are either younger than age 5 or older than age 6. We don't even have children at age 6 in grade 1. Right? So looking at whether it's a law or a policy, how is it getting implemented? What's coming in the way? Or what is it that we as practitioners, you and I, can do to actually make it happen? I think that's one big piece. And the other is, I think this entire effort is so that, children are equipped for school and the world at the end of the day, right? So let's say in the early years, we have 5 years. So our children actually prepared for the next 3 years on this continuum. It says the policy says 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4. So if we get our work right in the first 5 years, are they ready for the next 3 years?
Right.
Because that is the intention behind this, what the policy is saying. So does that happen? And then I think last but not the least, is it happening only for the boys, or are the girls also right there along with the boys, or perhaps ahead?
Right.
I think these are some of the things that we would have to, we should be looking at, not just to document, but to change in a positive way.
Yeah, there's so many like nitty-gritties that we have to look at, and I think this sort of overarching lens of inclusion is something that's just absolutely missing, in many places. So
Yeah.
trying to bring that into every single aspect of this policy, I think that's going to be a task as well.
Yes. I think turning the policy into practice. That's the challenge.